The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Last Chance Saloon, and Clara Whitmore stepped down into the dusty street of Redemption Creek, Montana territory, with nothing but a worn carpet bag and bruises hidden beneath her high-necked dress. It was June of 1878, and she had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis with a singular purpose: to disappear where her husband's fists could never find her again. The town sprawled before her like a promise of freedom, rough-hewn buildings lining a main street that turned to mud when it rained, and dust when it didn't. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Clara drew a breath that didn't hurt for the first time in months, though her ribs still ached from where Martin had kicked her 2 weeks before she'd finally gathered the courage to flee. She had left in the dead of night, taking only what she could carry and the small inheritance her grandmother had left her. Money Martin hadn't known existed. The lawyer who'd handled the estate had helped her secure passage west and a position as a schoolteacher in this remote settlement. Martin would look for her, she knew, but Montana territory was vast and wild, and Redemption Creek was barely a dot on any map. "You must be Miss Whitmore." A woman's voice pulled Clara from her thoughts. She turned to find a stout woman in her 50s approaching, her face weathered but kind. "I'm Margaret Hayes, the mayor's wife. We've been expecting you." Clara managed to smile, though her face felt stiff from the effort. She wasn't used to kindness anymore. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Hayes. The school's been without a teacher since Miss Patterson married and moved to Helena. The children are eager to start their lessons again." Margaret took Clara's bag without asking, her grip firm and capable. "You look exhausted, dear. Let's get you settled at the boarding house and you can meet everyone properly tomorrow." The boarding house was a 2-story structure at the edge of town, run by a widow named Ruth Carmichael, who asked no questions and offered Clara a room on the 2nd floor with a window overlooking the mountains. It was small but clean, with a bed that didn't sag and curtains that someone had sewn with care. Clara stood at that window after Mrs. Hayes left, watching the sun sink toward the peaks, and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. She unpacked her few belongings carefully, hanging the 2 dresses she owned in the narrow wardrobe and placing her books on the small table by the window. Her fingers trembled as she touched the leather-bound volume of poetry her mother had given her years ago before consumption had taken her. Martin had thrown it at her once, splitting her lip open, but she'd never let him destroy it completely. That night, Clara lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to sounds she didn't recognize. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of wind through pine trees, the creak of the boarding house settling. No heavy footsteps in the hallway, no angry cursing, no door slamming open to reveal Martin's fury. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and allowed herself to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief. Morning came bright and early, sunlight streaming through her window with an intensity she wasn't used to after the dim curtained rooms Martin had kept her in. Clara dressed carefully, choosing her brown calico dress because it was the most modest, and pinned her dark hair into a tight bun that pulled at her scalp. She studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand, noting the fading yellow bruise along her jawline that she'd have to powder over, the healing cut at her temple hidden by her hair. 23 years old, and she looked older, tiredness etched into the corners of her eyes. Ruth Carmichael had breakfast waiting when Clara came downstairs. Eggs and bacon, and bread still warm from the oven. There were 2 other boarders, both miners who nodded politely before heading out to their claims. Ruth poured coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and studied Clara with sharp but sympathetic eyes. "You running from something or to something?" Ruth asked bluntly. Clara's hands stilled around her coffee cup. "Does it matter?" "Not to me." Ruth sat down across from her. "But you should know that Redemption Creek tends to attract folks looking for second chances. We don't pry and we don't judge. You do your job, treat people decent, and you'll find friends here." "Thank you," Clara whispered, meaning it. The school was a single room with wooden benches and a pot-bellied stove, a chalkboard that had seen better days, and windows that let in mountain light. Margaret Hayes introduced Clara to the 15 students who would be in her care, ranging from 6-year-old twins who could barely sit still to a lanky 14-year-old boy named Thomas who looked embarrassed to still be in school. Clara fell into teaching the way a drowning person grasps a rope. She'd been educated at a finishing school in St. Louis, had dreamed once of being a teacher before Martin had courted her with flowers and false gentleness. Now she poured all her energy into lessons, into helping young minds grow, into creating something good from the wreckage of her life. The days developed a rhythm. She woke early, prepared lessons, taught from 8 until 3, then spent her evenings reading or taking short walks around town. She spoke to people but kept herself distant, afraid that getting too close would mean explaining the bruises that were slowly fading, the way she still flinched when someone moved too quickly near her. It was on one of these evening walks, 3 weeks after her arrival, that she first saw him. Clara had ventured farther than usual, following a path that led toward the foothills where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color. She was so absorbed in the beauty of the landscape, in the freedom of being able to walk without permission, that she didn't notice the bear until it was too late. The grizzly was massive, rising up on its hind legs not 30 feet from where she stood frozen on the trail. Clara's scream caught in her throat, every survival instinct she possessed warring with the paralysis of terror. The bear roared, a sound that shook the air, and took a step toward her. Then he was there. He seemed to materialize from the trees themselves, a man so large and solid that for a moment Clara thought she was hallucinating. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the buckskin shirt he wore and arms corded with muscle that spoke of a life lived through physical labor. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and a beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, even in that moment of terror, pale blue and startlingly gentle in a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin. He stepped between Clara and the bear without hesitation, his body a wall of protection. When he spoke, his voice was low and calm, almost soothing. "Easy now, old girl. We don't want any trouble." The bear dropped to all fours, huffing and swaying. The man held his ground, one hand extended slightly behind him toward Clara in a gesture that was somehow both protective and reassuring. He didn't have a weapon drawn, didn't make any threatening moves. He just stood there, radiating a quiet confidence that even the bear seemed to recognize. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the grizzly turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. The man didn't move until the sounds of the bear's passage had faded completely, and even then he turned to Clara slowly, as if afraid of startling her. "You all right, ma'am?" His voice was rough from disuse but surprisingly gentle. Clara realized she was shaking, her entire body trembling with delayed reaction. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The man took a step closer, and she flinched violently, stumbling backward. The movement sent pain shooting through her still-healing ribs, and she gasped. He froze immediately, his hands coming up in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "Just want to make sure you're not injured." Something in his tone, in the careful way he held himself absolutely still, allowed Clara to take a breath. She looked at him properly for the first time and saw the concern in those blue eyes, the way his large hands were held open and unthreatening. I'm fine," she managed. "Thank you. You saved my life." "Bear probably wasn't interested in you anyway," he said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "You're the new schoolteacher, Miss Whitmore." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "How did you know?" "Small town. Word travels." He seemed to realize he was still standing close and took a deliberate step backward, giving her space. "I'm Nathaniel Coltrain. Folks call me Nate. I have a cabin up in the high country, but I come down to town for supplies sometimes. Mr. Coltrain." Clara's heart was still racing, but not entirely from the bear encounter anymore. There was something about this man, about the careful way he moved and spoke, that made her feel safe and terrified all at once. "I'm grateful for your help." "You shouldn't be out here alone this late," he said, not unkindly. "Sun's getting low, and the animals are more active. Let me walk you back to town." Every instinct Clara had developed over 3 years of marriage told her to refuse, to run, to never put herself in a position where a man had control over her safety. But the mountains were growing dark, and this man had just saved her from a grizzly bear without asking for anything in return. "All right," she said quietly. They walked in silence at first, Nate keeping a careful distance between them. Clara noticed the way he moved, quiet and sure-footed despite his size, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder that she hadn't even noticed before, and a knife at his belt that looked more like a tool than a weapon. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" she asked finally, more to break the silence than from real curiosity. 5 years, give or take. Came out here after the war. He didn't specify which side he'd fought on, and Clara didn't ask. "The quiet suits me." "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant it. "I've never seen country like this." "Where are you from?" He glanced at her, then quickly away, as if he'd noticed her flinch at the direct attention. "St. Louis. It's very different there." "I imagine so." They walked a few more steps before he added, "What brought you out to Montana Territory, if you don't mind my asking?" Clara's throat tightened. She couldn't tell him the truth, couldn't admit that she was running from a husband who thought his vows gave him the right to use her as a punching bag when the whiskey made him mean. "I wanted a fresh start," she said instead, which was true enough. Nate nodded as if he understood perfectly. "That's what these mountains are good for, fresh starts." They reached the edge of town as full darkness fell, and Nate stopped at the boundary where the trail met the main street. "You'll be all right from here?" "Yes. Thank you again, Mr. Coltrain." "Nate," he corrected gently. "And you're welcome, Miss Whitmore. Maybe stay closer to town on your walks from now on." Clara nodded and turned to go, but something made her look back. Nate was still standing there, watching to make sure she made it safely to the boarding house, his large frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. When he saw her looking, he touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a small salute, then turned and disappeared back into the gathering night. That night, Clara dreamed of blue eyes and gentle hands and woke feeling confused and guilty in equal measure. The next few days passed without incident. Clara threw herself into her teaching, working with the younger children on their letters and the older ones on arithmetic and geography. She discovered that she had a gift for making lessons interesting, for finding ways to connect book learning to the practical knowledge these mountain children already possessed. Thomas, the 14-year-old, turned out to be remarkably bright when it came to mathematics, and Clara began giving him more advanced problems to work on. The twins, Sarah and Samuel, were handfuls of energy but responded well to firm kindness. All of the children seemed starved for learning, for attention, for someone who believed they were capable of more than just surviving in this rough country. It was during lunch on Thursday that one of the older girls, a 12-year-old named Emma, approached Clara's desk with shy curiosity. "Miss Whitmore, is it true that Nate Coltrain walked you back to town the other night?" Clara looked up from the paper she was grading. "How did you hear about that?" "My pa saw you coming into town together. He said Nate doesn't usually come down from his cabin unless he needs to, and even then he doesn't talk to people much." "We encountered a bear on the trail," Clara explained. "Mr. Coltrain was kind enough to make sure I returned safely." Emma's eyes went wide. "A grizzly? You must have been so scared. But you were lucky Nate was there. They say he can track anything, and he knows these mountains better than anyone. He brings meat to folks sometimes when winter's been hard. Just leaves it on their porches and doesn't wait for thanks." Clara found herself curious despite her better judgment. "He lives alone?" "Yes, ma'am. Has a cabin way up in the high country. Folks say he came back from the war different, that he needed the solitude. But he's good people. My pa says Nate's the kind of man you want at your back when trouble comes." The conversation stayed with Clara long after the school day ended. She found herself thinking about Nathaniel Coltrain at odd moments. The careful way he'd held his hands up to avoid frightening her, the gentleness in his rough voice, the fact that he'd walked her safely home and then disappeared without expecting gratitude or reward. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. She certainly wasn't ready for any kind of attachment to a man, not after Martin. But there had been something in Nate's eyes, a recognition perhaps, as if he too knew what it was like to carry wounds that didn't show on the surface. Saturday brought the weekly market to Redemption Creek's main street, and Clara ventured out to purchase supplies. She was examining apples at one of the stalls when she heard a familiar voice. "Those ones are mealy. Try the barrel on the left." She turned to find Nate standing a respectful distance away, his arms full of goods, flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition. In the daylight, Clara could see him more clearly. He was probably in his early 30s, his face tanned and lined from weather and sun. The muscles in his forearms were clearly visible where he'd rolled up his sleeves, and there was a scar running along his left hand that looked old and well-healed. But it was his eyes that drew her again, that startling blue that seemed out of place in such a rugged face. "Thank you for the advice," Clara said, moving to the other barrel. Nate shifted his burden slightly. "How have you been?" "No more bear encounters, I hope." "None. I've been staying closer to town as you suggested." "Good." He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "The high country's beautiful this time of year, if you ever want to see it properly. With a guide, I mean. Someone who knows the safe trails." Clara's heart began to race, though whether from fear or something else she couldn't say. "Are you offering to be that guide, Mr. Coltrain?" "Nate," he corrected again, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "And yes, ma'am, I suppose I am. No pressure, of course. Just thought you might like to see more of the territory in safety." Every rational part of Clara's mind screamed at her to refuse. She barely knew this man. She had sworn to herself that she was done with men, done with trusting, done with putting herself in situations where she could be hurt. But there was something in Nate's expression, in the careful way he made the offer, that told her he would accept rejection with grace and never mention it again. And beneath her fear, there was a spark of something she'd thought Martin had beaten out of her completely, the desire to live, to experience beauty, to trust again. "I would like that," she heard herself say. "Perhaps next Saturday, if you're available." Nate's smile grew, transforming his face. "Next Saturday would be fine. I'll meet you at the edge of town, by the trail we took before. Early morning's best for seeing the country." "What time?" "Dawn, if that's not too early for you." Clara had been waking at dawn for years, trained by Martin's demands that breakfast be ready when he wanted it. "Dawn is perfect." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the bustle of the market, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them. Then Nate nodded, touched his fingers to his forehead in that same small salute, and moved away to continue his shopping. Margaret Hayes appeared at Clara's elbow almost immediately. "Well now," she said with barely suppressed delight. "That's interesting." "What is?" Clara asked, trying to sound innocent. "Nate Coltrain actually having a conversation in the middle of town and making plans, if my ears didn't deceive me." "He's simply going to show me some of the countryside," Clara said firmly. "As a guide, nothing more." Margaret's smile was knowing. "Of course, dear. Nothing more at all." The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara found herself distracted during lessons, her mind wandering to thoughts of the upcoming Saturday. She told herself repeatedly that this was foolish, that she was asking for trouble, that she should send word to Nate and cancel the whole thing. But she didn't. She also found herself paying more attention to her appearance, spending extra time brushing her hair until it shone, choosing her best dress for church on Sunday. Ruth Carmichael noticed but said nothing, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. Friday night, Clara barely slept. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the town settling into night, her mind spinning with anxiety and anticipation. What was she doing? She was a married woman, even if she'd fled her husband. In the eyes of the law, she belonged to Martin Whitmore, and taking a walk with another man could be considered improper at best, adultery at worst. But Montana Territory was far from St. Louis, and no one here knew she was married. She'd introduced herself as Miss Whitmore, and no one had questioned it. Out here, people took you at your word and didn't pry into what you'd left behind. Still, the guilt gnawed at her. Not guilt over Martin, who had forfeited any claim to her loyalty the first time he'd raised his fist, but guilt over her own feelings, the way her heart quickened when she thought of Nate, the way she found herself looking forward to Saturday with an intensity that frightened her. Dawn came finally, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Clara dressed in her most practical outfit, a split skirt she'd purchased for riding back in St. Louis, but had never worn because Martin disapproved of women on horseback. She braided her hair and pinned it up, packed a small bag with water and some bread and cheese Ruth had pressed on her, and slipped out of the boarding house before the other residents were awake. Nate was waiting at the trailhead, and Clara's breath caught when she saw him. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, his hair freshly washed and tied back, his buckskin shirt obviously brushed clean. He held the reins of 2 horses, sturdy mountain ponies that looked sure-footed and calm. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I brought Maple for you. She's gentle and knows the trails." "I haven't ridden in some time," Clara admitted. "It'll come back to you." Nate held Maple's reins while Clara mounted, his hands carefully avoiding any unnecessary contact. Once she was settled, he swung onto his own horse with easy grace and led the way toward the mountains. They rode in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, following a trail that wound through pine forests and across meadows carpeted with wildflowers. The air was clean and cool, scented with sage and pine, and Clara felt tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying begin to drain from her shoulders. Nate proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, sharing bits of knowledge about the plants and animals they passed. He showed her where a fox had its den, where eagles nested in the tall pines, where a mountain stream ran cold and clear enough to drink from. "This is incredible," Clara said as they paused at a viewpoint overlooking a valley. "I had no idea such beauty existed." "Most people don't," Nate said. "They're too busy trying to survive to notice, but the land's always here, waiting for those who take the time to see it." Clara turned to look at him. "Is that why you came up here? To see the land?" Nate was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "I came up here because I needed to be somewhere that made sense," he said finally. "The war didn't make sense, the things I saw, the things I did. I came home and everything felt wrong, like my skin didn't fit anymore. People would talk to me and all I could hear was cannon fire. Women would smile at me and all I could see was blood." He paused, and Clara waited, understanding that this was something he didn't share often. "The mountains don't lie," he continued. "They don't pretend to be one thing and turn into something else. A storm is a storm. A bear is a bear. There's an honesty to it that I needed. Still need, I suppose." "I understand," Clara said softly. "About needing honesty." Nate looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw understanding in his eyes. "Something happened to you," he said. "It wasn't a question. Something that made you need a fresh start." Clara's hands tightened on Maple's reins. She should deny it, should turn the conversation to safer topics. But there was something about this place, about this man, that made her want to be honest for the first time in years. "Yes," she whispered. "Something happened." "You don't have to tell me," Nate said quickly. "Your past is your business. I just want you to know that whatever it was, you're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you." The promise in his words made Clara's throat tight with emotion. "How can you say that? You barely know me." "I know enough." Nate's voice was firm. "I know you're brave enough to start over in a place where you don't know anyone. I know you're kind, from the way the children talk about you. I know you've been hurt from the way you flinch when someone gets too close, and I know that you deserve better than whatever you left behind." Tears burned Clara's eyes. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Coltrain." "Nate," he said again, gentler this time, "and I've spent 5 years watching animals and reading weather. You learn to pay attention to the small things." They continued their ride, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Nate told her about his cabin, about the work of living alone in the mountains, about the seasons and how they changed the land. Clara found herself talking more freely than she had in years, sharing memories of her childhood, her love of books, her dreams of being a teacher. "Those dreams came true," Nate pointed out. "That takes courage." "Or desperation," Clara said before she could stop herself. "Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes we need to be desperate enough to be brave." They stopped for lunch beside a waterfall that tumbled down mossy rocks into a crystal pool. Nate unpacked supplies from his saddlebags and spread them on a flat rock, bread and cheese that matched Clara's contribution, strips of dried venison, early strawberries he must have picked that morning. "I can't remember the last time I had strawberries," Clara said, biting into one. The sweetness exploded on her tongue. "There's a patch about a mile from my cabin. They're just starting to come ripe." They ate in companionable silence, the roar of the waterfall providing a soothing backdrop. Clara watched Nate from the corner of her eye, noting the economical way he moved, the size of his hands as they broke bread. Hands that could probably break a man in half, but held the strawberries like they were made of glass. "Why did you ask me to come with you today?" Clara asked suddenly. Nate looked up from his meal, his blue eyes steady on hers. "Honestly? Please. Because when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it's like to be broken, and I wanted you to see that broken things can still find beauty, can still find peace." He paused. "And because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day I saw you on that trail." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. Nate, I can't. I'm not ready for whatever you're thinking. I'm not asking you to be ready for anything, he said quietly. I'm just being honest about what I feel. You want honesty, right? Well, honestly, you're the first person in 5 years who's made me want to come down from my mountain, who's made me want to talk instead of being silent. That means something. I'm married. The words burst from Clara before she could stop them. I mean, legally I'm still married. I left my husband, but we're not divorced. I ran away in the night because if I'd stayed, he would have killed me eventually. So you see, I'm not free. I can never be free. The confession hung between them like smoke. Clara waited for shock, for disgust, for Nate to stand up and take her back to town immediately. Instead, he simply nodded. Does he know where you are? No, I don't think so. I was very careful. Will he look for you? Probably. Martin doesn't like losing things he considers his property. Nate's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his beard. A man who treats his wife as property isn't a man. He's a coward and a bully. He's still my legal husband. The law isn't always right. The law said slavery was acceptable once. The law sent men to die in fields for causes that didn't matter. Sometimes the law is just words written by people who've never had to live with the consequences. Clara stared at him. That's a very radical view, Mr. Coltrain. Nate, he corrected automatically. And maybe it is. But I've seen enough of the world to know that doing the right thing and doing the legal thing aren't always the same. You left a man who hurt you. That was the right thing. Everything else is just details. You make it sound simple. It is simple. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be happy. Anyone who says different is wrong. Clara felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart to survive Martin's cruelty. Why are you being so kind to me? Nate reached across the space between them, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. May I? Clara looked at his outstretched hand, at the calluses and scars, at the sheer size of it. Every instinct screamed at her to pull away, to protect herself. But she thought of the gentle way he'd held those strawberries, the careful distance he always maintained, the respect in his eyes. Slowly, shakily, she placed her hand in his. Nate's fingers closed around hers with exquisite gentleness, as if she were made of spun glass. His hand was warm and rough, completely engulfing hers, but the touch was soft, reverent almost. I'm being kind because you deserve kindness, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. Because every person deserves to be touched with gentleness instead of violence. Because I look at you and see someone brave and strong and beautiful, and I want to know what it would be like if you weren't afraid anymore. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time Martin had touched her without causing pain, couldn't remember what it felt like to have a man's hand on hers and not flinch away. But Nate's touch was different. His strength was leashed, controlled, offered instead of imposed. I'm so broken, she whispered. So am I, Nate said. Maybe we can be broken together. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who understand what it's like to hurt, trying to find a little bit of peace in a hard world. Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-browned skin and her paler fingers. She thought about Martin, about the years of pain and fear. She thought about the freedom she'd found in Montana territory, about the life she was trying to build. And she thought about this man, this gentle giant who lived alone in the mountains and somehow saw value in her damaged self. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to trust, how to be close to someone without being terrified. Then we'll figure it out together, Nate said. We'll go as slow as you need. We'll stop whenever you want. You're in control, Clara. Always. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something warm unfurl in her chest. Okay, she breathed. Okay. They sat there by the waterfall, hands joined, as the sun moved across the sky and the water sang its ancient song. And for the first time since she could remember, Clara felt something other than fear when a man touched her. She felt safe. The ride back to town that evening was different from the morning journey. Clara felt lighter somehow, as if confessing her truth had released some of the weight she'd been carrying. Nate kept glancing at her, small smiles touching his lips, and Each time their eyes met, Clara felt that same warm flutter in her chest. When they reached the edge of Redemption Creek, Nate helped her down from Maple with careful hands at her waist, his touch brief and respectful. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "Not just a planned outing. Maybe I could come to town more often. We could have supper at the restaurant, or I could walk with you in the evenings." Clara knew she should say no. She should focus on her teaching, on building a life that didn't involve complications. But when she looked at Nate, at the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. "I would like that," she said. "Good." Nate's smile was like sunrise. "I'll come by tomorrow evening, if that suits you." "Tomorrow is Sunday. I'll be at church in the morning, but the evening would be lovely." "Church," Nate repeated, looking uncomfortable. "I haven't been to church since before the war." "You don't have to come," Clara said quickly. "I just meant that I'll be free in the evening." But Nate was already shaking his head. "If you're going to be there, maybe it's time I showed my face. The town probably thinks I'm a heathen anyway." Clara laughed, the sound surprising her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd genuinely laughed. "You don't have to do that for me." "I want to," Nate said firmly. "Besides, it's probably good for my soul. God knows it could use some tending." They said goodnight, and Clara walked back to the boarding house with a lightness in her step that made Ruth raise her eyebrows when she came through the door. "Good day in the mountains?" Ruth asked innocently. "Wonderful," Clara said, and couldn't stop smiling. Sunday morning dawned, clear and bright, and Clara dressed with extra care, choosing her best dress and spending time on her hair. She told herself it wasn't for Nate, that she always tried to look presentable for church, but Ruth's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooling anyone. The church was a simple white building with a cross on top and windows that let in the mountain light. Clara had been attending services since her arrival, finding comfort in the familiar hymns and the sense of community. Reverend Thomas was a kind man in his 60s who preached more about love and forgiveness than fire and brimstone, and Clara had begun to find real solace in his messages. She was standing outside talking to Margaret Hayes when she heard the murmur run through the crowd. Turning, she saw Nate walking up the path to the church, and her breath caught. He'd cleaned up properly for the occasion, wearing dark trousers and a white shirt that strained across his broad shoulders, his hair tied back neatly. He walked with obvious discomfort, like a wild animal forced into captivity, but his eyes sought Clara's and softened when he found her. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said formally. "Mrs. Hayes." "Why, Nathaniel Coltrain," Margaret said with delight. "I don't think I've seen you at services since you first came to Redemption Creek. Welcome back." "Thank you, ma'am." Nate's discomfort was palpable, but he stood his ground. Other townspeople began approaching, greeting Nate with genuine warmth. Clara realized that while Nate kept himself separate, he was respected and liked. The men shook his hand with real friendship, and the women smiled at him kindly. Several people mentioned meat that had mysteriously appeared on their porches during hard times, venison and elk that had kept their families fed. Nate deflected the thanks awkwardly, his eyes returning again and again to Clara, as if she were his anchor in this sea of socialization. The service was beautiful. Reverend Thomas spoke about new beginnings and second chances, about God's grace being available to all who sought it, and Clara felt as if the words were meant specifically for her. Beside her in the pew, Nate sat stiffly at first, but gradually relaxed as the familiar hymns and rhythms of worship worked their way into his bones. When they sang Amazing Grace, Clara heard Nate's voice join in, a deep bass that resonated in her chest. His voice cracked on the line, "That saved a wretch like me." And Clara looked over to see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. Without thinking, she reached over and took his hand. Nate's fingers closed around hers immediately, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. After the service, several people invited them to Sunday dinner, but Nate politely declined, looking to Clara for guidance. She suggested a walk instead, and they set off toward the edge of town, still hand in hand. "That was harder than facing the grizzly," Nate admitted once they were alone. Clara laughed. "You did wonderfully, and I think people were happy to see you." "They're good folks," Nate acknowledged. "I've just gotten used to being alone. Having that many people around, that much noise and expectation, it makes my skin crawl. But you came anyway. For you." Nate stopped walking and turned to face her. Clara, I need you to understand something. I'm not good with people. I'm rough and I'm awkward, and I've spent so long alone that I've probably forgotten half the social graces I ever knew. But I want to try. For you, I want to try. Clara felt her eyes fill with tears. You don't have to change yourself for me, Nate. I'm not changing. I'm growing. There's a difference. He reached up slowly, telegraphing his movement, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You're crying. Did I say something wrong? No, Clara managed. You said something very right. I'm just not used to it. Nate's expression darkened. He made you cry a lot, didn't he? Your husband, Clara nodded, unable to speak. I'm going to make you a promise, Nate said, his voice rough with emotion. For as long as you'll let me be part of your life, my hands will only know gentleness when they touch you. You'll never have to flinch away from me. You'll never have to be afraid. I swear it on everything I hold sacred. The promise hung in the air between them, solemn and binding. Clara looked up at this man, this mountain of muscle and strength who was offering her tenderness instead of terror, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. I believe you, she whispered, and realized with wonder that it was true. They spent the rest of the day together, walking and talking, sharing stories and dreams. Nate told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about losing his parents to fever, about the war and the things he'd seen. Clara shared memories of her mother, her education, the early days with Martin before the drinking and the violence started. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, they made their way back to the boarding house. At the door, Nate released her hand reluctantly. Can I see you again soon? He asked. Yes, Clara said without hesitation. Yes, please. Tomorrow after school? I'll be ready. Nate smiled, that transformative expression that made him look younger and less burdened. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a feather-light kiss to her knuckles, his beard soft against her skin. Good night, Clara. Good night, Nate. She watched him walk away into the gathering dusk, then floated into the boarding house in a daze. Ruth was in the parlor, pretending to read but clearly waiting up. You look happy, Ruth observed. I am, Clara said, and realized it was true. I'm happy. The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Nate began coming to town almost daily, timing his visits to coincide with the end of Clara's school day. They would walk together, sometimes through town, sometimes along the safer trails at the edge of the mountains. They talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation of friendship that felt solid and real. Nate was unfailingly gentle, always asking permission before touching her, always respecting her boundaries. He seemed to have an instinct for when Clara was feeling overwhelmed, would back off and give her space without making her feel guilty for needing it. And slowly, so slowly, Clara began to relax around him. She stopped flinching when he moved quickly. She learned to accept his hand without her heart racing in panic. She discovered that she liked being touched by him, liked the warmth of his palm against hers, liked the way his arm felt when she worked up the courage to take it as they walked. The townspeople watched their courtship with approval and interest. Margaret Hayes took credit for introducing them, though that wasn't quite accurate. The children in Clara's class began leaving little drawings for Mr. Nate on her desk, pictures of mountains and bears and flowers that Nate accepted with grave seriousness and obvious pleasure. But not everything was peaceful. One afternoon in late July, Clara was walking alone through town when she heard shouting from the saloon. A stagecoach had arrived, and among the passengers was a man in a dusty suit who was loudly proclaiming that he was looking for a missing woman. Clara's blood turned to ice. She ducked into the general store, her heart pounding, and watched through the window as the man questioned people on the street. He was a Pinkerton detective, he announced, hired to find a Mrs. Clara Whitmore, who had absconded from her lawful husband in St. Louis. The description he gave was vague enough: dark hair, brown eyes, medium height, early 20s. It could have been a dozen women. But Clara knew. Martin had found her, or at least had hired someone to find her. She stayed in the general store until the detective moved on, then hurried back to the boarding house by a back route. Ruth found her in her room, shaking and pale, and didn't ask questions before bringing her tea and sitting beside her. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone, Ruth said quietly. There's a detective in town, Clara whispered. "Looking for me. My husband sent him." Ruth's expression hardened. "I see. And are you planning to go back to this husband?" "No, never. But I don't know if I have a choice. Legally, I'm his wife. He has every right to take me back." "The law isn't the only authority," Ruth said firmly. "This is Montana territory, not St. Louis. We take care of our own out here." Clara wanted to believe her, but fear had its claws in her chest. "He'll find me eventually. That detective will ask around, and someone will mention the new schoolteacher who matches the description. Then we'll make sure they don't mention you," Ruth said. "You leave this to me." But Clara knew she couldn't leave it to Ruth, couldn't put the kind woman at risk. There was only one person she wanted to tell, one person she thought might understand. She had to find Nate. Clara slipped out of the boarding house after dark, making her way through the quiet streets to the livery stable where Nate kept his horses when he stayed in town. The proprietor, an old man named Jack, knew her by sight now and nodded when she asked if Nate was around. "Up in the loft," Jack said he had some thinking to do. Clara climbed the ladder to the loft and found Nate sitting in the hay, looking out through the open door at the stars. He turned when he heard her approach, and his expression immediately shifted to concern. "Clara? What's wrong?" The words came tumbling out. The detective, Martin, the fear that she would be forced to return to St. Louis. Nate listened without interrupting, his jaw growing tighter with each word, his hands clenching into fists. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, voice low and dangerous, "He's not taking you anywhere. He has the law on his side, Nate. I'm legally Martin's wife." "I don't care about the law." Nate stood, his full height and breadth suddenly intimidating in the small space. "I care about you, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you or force you to go back to a man who treats you like property." "What can you do? If the detective finds me, if he has legal documents, then we'll leave," Nate said simply. "Tonight if we have to. We'll go up into the high country where no Pinkerton detective can follow. We'll disappear." Clara stared at him. "You would do that? Give up your cabin, your life here, just to keep me safe?" "Yes," Nate said without hesitation. "Clara, I'd give up everything to keep you safe. Don't you understand that by now?" "But why? We've only known each other a few weeks." Nate crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "Because I love you," he said, the words raw and honest. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing in front of that bear, terrified but not running. I've loved you through every walk, every conversation, every smile you've given me. I know it's too soon. I know you're not ready to hear it, but it's the truth, and I won't hide it." Clara felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Nate, I'm married. I can't—" "You're married to a man who hurt you," Nate interrupted. "That doesn't count. In my eyes, in God's eyes, you're free. And I'm asking you to choose freedom, choose life, choose me." Tears streamed down Clara's face. "I'm so afraid." "I know," Nate's voice gentled, "but you don't have to be afraid anymore. I'll protect you. I'll keep you safe. All you have to do is trust me." Clara looked up at this man, this gentle giant, who was offering her everything she'd ever wanted: safety, love, protection, given instead of demanded. She thought about Martin, about the years of pain. She thought about the life she'd been building in Redemption Creek. And she thought about Nate, about the tenderness in his eyes, about the way his hands had only ever touched her with gentleness. "I do trust you," she said. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since you stood between me and that bear. Since you walked me home and asked for nothing in return. Since you promised your hands would only know tenderness." Nate made a sound low in his throat, something between a laugh and a sob. "Say it again." "I love you, Nathaniel Coltrain." "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Please, Clara, I need to kiss you." Clara nodded, her heart racing, but not from fear. Nate cupped her face in his large hands with exquisite gentleness, his thumbs brushing away her tears. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet and reverent, nothing like the brutal, claiming kisses Martin had forced on her. Nate kissed her like she was precious, like she was cherished, like he had all the time in the world and wanted to spend it worshiping her mouth. Clara felt something break open inside her, some last wall of defense crumbling, and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Nate rested his forehead against hers. "We'll figure this out," he promised, "together. But right now, you need to go back to the boarding house before Ruth worries. And tomorrow, we'll make a plan." "What kind of plan?" "The kind that keeps you here, in Redemption Creek where you belong. The kind that makes sure no detective and no husband can take you away from the life you've built." Nate's eyes were fierce. "Trust me, Clara. I won't let you down." Clara believed him. For the first time in years, she believed completely. The next morning, Clara woke to find that half the town seemed to have conspired overnight. When the Pinkerton detective continued his inquiries, he was met with blank stares and vague answers. The new schoolteacher? Yes, they had one. But she was much older, in her 40s at least. No young women matching his description had arrived in the past few months. Margaret Hayes was particularly convincing, describing a completely fictional teacher in elaborate detail. The blacksmith swore the only newcomers had been a family of minors. Even the children, when questioned after school, looked at the detective with innocent eyes and said their teacher was old Miss Whitmore, who had gray hair and spectacles. The detective spent 3 days in Redemption Creek, growing increasingly frustrated. Clara stayed mostly out of sight, teaching her classes but avoiding the main street. Nate was never far away, his presence a constant reassurance. On the 4th day, the detective gave up and boarded the stagecoach heading west, muttering about wild goose chases and unreliable informants. The entire town watched him leave, then collectively exhaled. "That was close," Margaret said to Clara over tea that afternoon. "But we take care of our own out here. You're one of us now." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know how to repay such kindness." "Keep teaching our children," Margaret said simply. "Keep being the good woman we've come to know. That's payment enough." But Clara knew the danger wasn't over. Martin would send other detectives, would keep looking. As long as she was legally married to him, she would never be truly free. That evening, she shared her fears with Nate as they walked along the river. "There has to be a way to dissolve the marriage," Nate said thoughtfully. "Grounds for divorce that would hold up even in St. Louis courts." "Desertion, maybe," Clara said. "But that takes years and Martin would fight it. He doesn't love me, but he won't let go of what he considers his." "What about cruelty? Could you prove it?" Clara thought of the bruises that had finally faded, the scars on her body that told the story of 3 years of violence. Maybe. But it would mean going back, facing him in court, reliving everything. "Not if we could get witnesses," Nate said slowly. "Doctors who treated you, neighbors who heard the fights, anyone who saw what he did." "I never told anyone," Clara admitted. "I was too ashamed. I thought if I was a better wife, if I tried harder, he would stop." Nate stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "It wasn't your fault. Nothing you did or didn't do gave him the right to hurt you. You know that. Ooh, right? Intellectually, yes. But in my heart, I still sometimes wonder." "Don't," Nate said fiercely. "Don't give him that power. He's a coward who hurt someone smaller and weaker because he could. That's all. You're strong for surviving. You're brave for leaving. And you're incredible for building a new life." Clara leaned into him, letting his strength support her. "What am I going to do, Nate?" "We're going to find a way," he promised. "I'll write to a lawyer I knew before the war, someone who practices in Denver. He's a good man, and he knows the law. If there's a way to free you legally, he'll find it." It was a thread of hope, thin but real. Clara clung to it as the summer days lengthened and deepened. Nate was true to his word, sending a letter to his lawyer friend and waiting impatiently for a response. In the meantime, their relationship continued to grow. Clara found herself falling deeper in love with Nate every day, marveling at his gentleness, his patience, his unwavering support. He never pressured her for more than she was ready to give, content to hold her hand and steal occasional sweet kisses. But Clara could feel the tension building in him, could see the way his eyes darkened when he looked at her, could sense the careful control he maintained. One evening in August, after he'd walked her back to the boarding house, she stopped him on the porch. "Nate, I want you to know that I'm not afraid of you, not anymore. I trust you completely." Nate's hands tightened on hers. I'm glad. You don't know what that means to me. I think I do. Clara gathered her courage. I want to be with you. Really with you. Not just walks and conversations. I want to belong to you in every way. Nate closed his eyes, his whole body tensing. Clara, you're still married. I won't dishonor you like that. I was never truly married, Clara said fiercely. Not in the ways that matter. Martin never cherished me, never honored me. Those vows were broken the first time he raised his fist. You're more my husband than he ever was. But the law, damn the law, Clara said, the profanity shocking them both. I'm sorry, but I mean it. The law says I'm Martin's property. The law says he had the right to hurt me. The law is wrong. My heart says I'm yours, Nate. If you'll have me. Nate pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her carefully, always carefully. You're sure? I need you to be absolutely sure. I've never been more sure of anything. Then marry me, Nate said suddenly. I know it won't be legal, not yet. But marry me in the ways that matter, in front of God and these mountains and anyone who wants to witness it. Bind yourself to me the way I'm already bound to you. Clara pulled back to look at him. You want to marry me? I've wanted to marry you since the first week I knew you, Nate admitted. I just didn't think it was possible. But if you're willing to claim me, to make vows, even if they're not recognized by law, then yes. Marry me, Clara. Be my wife in truth. Joy flooded through Clara, bright and overwhelming. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I'll marry you. They told Reverend Thomas the next day, explaining the situation honestly. The old minister listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. Wayne, what you're describing is common law marriage, he said finally. It's recognized in Montana territory. If you present yourselves as husband and wife, live as such, the law will eventually acknowledge the union. But Clara is still legally married in Missouri, Nate pointed out. Missouri law doesn't have jurisdiction here, Reverend Thomas said, and even if it did, I believe in a higher law than what's written in books. This young woman fled abuse. She's seeking safety and love with a good man. In God's eyes, her first marriage ended when her husband broke his vows through violence. I'll marry you gladly, and I'll record it in the church registry. Let the courts sort out the legalities later. They were married a week later, on a Sunday afternoon with half the town in attendance. Clara wore a simple white dress that Margaret Hayes had helped her sew, and wildflowers in her hair that Nate had picked that morning. Nate wore his best clothes, his hair neatly tied back, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They stood before Reverend Thomas in the small church, sunlight streaming through the windows, and made promises that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with love. I, Nathaniel Coltrain, take you, Clara, to be my wife. I promise to cherish you, to protect you, to honor your strength and heal your wounds. I promise that my hands will only ever know tenderness when they touch you, and my heart will only ever know love when it thinks of you, from this day forward, for as long as we both shall live. Clara's voice shook with emotion as she made her own vows. I, Clara Whitmore, take you, Nathaniel, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, to stand beside you, to love you with everything I am. You've shown me what it means to be cherished instead of controlled, protected instead of hurt. You've taught me that I'm worthy of gentleness. I give you my heart freely, with no fear, knowing you'll guard it as carefully as you guard everything you love, from this day forward, for as long as we both shall live. Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and when Nate kissed her, the whole congregation erupted in cheers. Clara laughed against his mouth, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. This was what happiness felt like. This was what love was supposed to be. The townspeople had organized a celebration at the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Clara had never danced before. Martin had forbidden it, saying it was sinful. But Nate took her hand and led her through simple steps, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. You're beautiful, he murmured, spinning her carefully. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I love you, Clara said, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They stayed until the celebration wound down, accepting congratulations and good wishes, then finally slipped away as the sun began to set. Nate had prepared his cabin for her, riding up earlier in the week to clean and arrange things. Now he helped her onto Maple, then swung onto his own horse, and they rode into the mountains as husband and wife. The cabin was exactly as Clara had imagined, a sturdy log structure nestled in a meadow with mountains rising all around and a stream running nearby. Nate had added touches for her comfort, curtains in the windows, a rocking chair on the porch, wildflowers in a jar on the table. He carried her over the threshold, setting her down gently in the middle of the single large room. The cabin was simple but well made, with a stone fireplace, a bed covered in quilts, shelves lined with books, and a kitchen area that was surprisingly organized. "It's not much," Nate said, suddenly nervous, "not like what you're used to in St. Louis." "It's perfect," Clara said honestly. "It's ours." Nate lit lamps against the gathering darkness, then stood awkwardly in the middle of his own cabin, clearly unsure what to do next. Clara realized with a start that he was as nervous as she was, maybe more so. "Nate," she said softly, "come here." He crossed to her immediately, and Clara took his hands in hers. They were shaking slightly, these hands that could fell trees and track bears. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Not of you, never of you. But I'm scared I'll hurt you by accident, that I'll be too rough, too eager, that I'll make you afraid of me." Clara's heart swelled with love for this gentle man. She raised his hands to her lips and kissed each palm tenderly. "You won't hurt me," she said. "I trust you, Nate. Show me what it means to be loved by hands that are gentle." What followed was tender and slow and perfect. Nate touched her like she was made of glass and starlight, his large hands impossibly careful as he helped her from her dress, as he laid her on the bed, as he loved her with a reverence that made her weep. He kissed every scar Martin had left, every faded bruise, every mark of pain, and replaced the memories of violence with touches of exquisite gentleness. Clara had expected to be afraid, had braced herself for painful flashbacks. But with Nate, there was only love, only safety, only the overwhelming feeling of being cherished completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the quilts, Clara's head on Nate's broad chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "Are you all right?" Nate asked, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I didn't hurt you?" "You were perfect," Clara assured him. "Everything was perfect." "I love you so much," Nate said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't believe you're really mine." "I can't believe I'm free," Clara whispered. "For the first time in my life, I'm truly free." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, as the mountain night settled around their cabin and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The next weeks were the happiest of Clara's life. She moved permanently to Nate's cabin, though she continued teaching, riding into town 3 days a week for school and staying at the boarding house on those nights. The other 4 days she spent in the mountains with Nate, learning the rhythms of his life, the work of surviving in this beautiful wilderness. Nate taught her to fish in the cold streams, to identify edible plants, to read weather in the clouds and animal behavior. He showed her the secret places he'd discovered in 5 years of solitude. Hidden waterfalls, meadows carpeted with flowers, caves where ancient peoples had left their marks on stone. In turn, Clara brought books and learning to the cabin. She read aloud to Nate in the evenings, everything from poetry to philosophy to adventure novels. They discussed ideas and dreams, politics and faith, building an intimacy of mind to match the physical intimacy they'd discovered. Clara also began to heal in ways she hadn't expected. The constant fear that had been her companion for 3 years began to fade. She stopped flinching at sudden movements, stopped calculating escape routes in every room. With Nate, she learned what it meant to feel safe in her own skin, to trust that she wouldn't be hurt for imagined slights or perceived failures. And Nate bloomed under her love like a flower finally receiving water. He smiled more, laughed more, gradually became more comfortable around other people when they went to town. The war-haunted look in his eyes softened, replaced by peace and contentment. In September, a letter arrived from Nate's lawyer friend in Denver. It contained both good news and complications. The good news was that Montana Territory did recognize common law marriage, and as long as Clara and Nate presented themselves as married and lived as such, they would be considered legally wed in the territory. The complication was that this wouldn't necessarily be recognized in Missouri, and if Martin discovered Clara's whereabouts and could prove the first marriage was still valid, he could potentially cause trouble. The lawyer suggested two courses of action: either pursue a divorce from Martin on grounds of cruelty, which would require Clara to return to Missouri for court proceedings, or wait the required time period and file for divorce on grounds of desertion, which could be done without Clara's presence if they had a good lawyer. "I don't want you anywhere near that man," Nate said flatly when they discussed the letter. "We'll wait. We'll file for desertion when the time comes. In the meantime, as far as Montana territory is concerned, you're Clara Coltrain, and that's all that matters." Clara loved the sound of her new name, loved the way Nate said it with such pride and possession. She agreed to wait, to let time and distance do their work. Martin would eventually give up looking for her, would likely remarry or at least move on, and someday she would be free, not just in practice, but in law. The autumn was glorious, the mountains blazing with color as the aspen turned gold and the scrub oak burned red. Nate took Clara on long rides through the high country, showing her vistas that took her breath away. They made love under the stars, in meadows of wildflowers, in the cabin with rain drumming on the roof. And each time, Nate was tender and careful, proving again and again that his hands knew only gentleness when they touched her. In October, Clara realized she might be pregnant. She'd missed her monthly courses, and there was a tenderness to her breasts that she remembered from conversations with other women. The possibility filled her with complex emotions: joy at the thought of Nate's child, but fear about bringing a baby into a situation that was still legally complicated. She told Nate one evening as they sat by the fire, his arms around her, her back against his chest. "I think I might be with child," she said quietly. Nate went very still. "You're sure?" "Not completely, but the signs are there." Nate turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," Clara admitted. "Happy, worried, all of it at once." "I'm going to be a father," Nate said wonderingly. Then his face split in a grin so wide it transformed him. "Clara, we're going to have a baby." His joy was infectious, and Clara found herself laughing. "You're happy about this?" "Happy? I'm thrilled. Terrified, but thrilled." Nate placed a large hand carefully on her still flat stomach. "Our child. A piece of you and me together. How could I be anything but happy?" Clara placed her hand over his. "I was worried you might think it was too soon, that we should wait until the legal situation was resolved." "Life doesn't wait for legal situations," Nate said firmly. "This baby is a blessing, Clara, a gift. We'll figure out the rest." As autumn turned to winter, Clara's pregnancy became obvious. The women of Redemption Creek rallied around her, offering advice and support and hand-sewn baby clothes. No one questioned the timing or the legality of her marriage. In the rough-and-tumble world of Montana territory, common-law marriages were accepted and respected. Clara continued teaching through December, then finally had to stop as her belly grew too large for comfort. She spent the winter months in the cabin with Nate, reading and sewing and preparing for the baby. Nate was attentive and protective, barely letting her lift anything heavy, making sure she was warm and comfortable and had everything she needed. The baby came in early March of 1879, during a late-season blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Nate delivered his own son with shaking hands and streaming tears, catching the squalling infant and placing him on Clara's chest with a reverence that made her weep. "A boy," Nate breathed. "We have a son." They named him Daniel, after Nate's father. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced and loud, with a surprisingly full head of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue as his father's. Nate was besotted from the first moment, handling his son with the same careful gentleness he showed Clara. He walked the floor with Daniel when he cried, changed his soiled cloths without complaint, and stared at the baby for hours as if he couldn't quite believe this miracle was real. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed to Clara one night as they lay in bed, Daniel asleep in a cradle Nate had made. "A family. Love. Children. I thought I was too broken, too damaged by the war." "You were never broken," Clara said, reaching for his hand. "Just hurting. There's a difference." "You healed me," Nate said simply. "You and Daniel. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain." Spring brought warmth back to the high country, and with it, a visitor. The lawyer from Denver arrived in Redemption Creek in April, bearing news. Martin Whitmore had died in February, killed in a bar fight in St. Louis. The lawyer had documentation, a death certificate, witness statements, everything needed to prove that Clara was a widow. "You're free," the lawyer said, spreading the papers on the table. "Legally, officially free. The marriage is dissolved by death. There's nothing standing in the way now." Clara stared at the papers, feeling a complex tangle of emotions. She wasn't sorry Martin was dead. He'd been a violent man who hurt people, and the world was probably better without him. But she also felt a strange sense of closure, as if a chapter of her life had finally, definitively ended. "What does this mean for us?" she asked Nate. "It means we can make it official," Nate said. "We can have another ceremony, get a legal license, make sure no one can ever question your status as my wife." They were married again in May, with Daniel in attendance and the whole town celebrating. This time, the marriage was legal in every sense, recorded not just in the church registry, but in the territorial records. Clara signed her name as Clara Coltrain and felt the last chains of her past fall away. The years that followed were full of love and growth. Daniel thrived in the mountain air, becoming a strong, happy child who worshipped his father. Nate and Clara had 2 more children, a daughter named Emma in 1881 and another son, James, in 1883. Nate built additions to the cabin as their family grew, creating bedrooms and extra space. He also began spending more time in town, taking on occasional work as a guide and tracker, becoming more integrated into the community without losing his love for the mountains. Clara continued teaching when she could, and eventually started a small school that met twice a week for children who lived in the more remote areas. She wrote articles about education and frontier life that were published in Eastern newspapers, using her voice to advocate for better schools and opportunities in the territories. But the heart of their life remained the cabin in the high country, the place where they'd built their love. On their 10th anniversary, they stood on the porch watching their children play in the meadow, Nate's arms around Clara, her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" Nate asked. "Leaving St. Louis, coming out here, all of it?" "Never," Clara said without hesitation. "This life, with you, with our children, in these mountains, it's everything I never knew I could have. You saved me, Nate. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Nate said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Before you, I was just surviving. You taught me how to live again." Their children's laughter drifted up from the meadow, sweet and pure. Daniel was teaching Emma how to skip rocks in the stream, while baby James toddled after them. It was a scene of perfect domesticity, of peace hard-won and carefully maintained. "I love you," Clara said, turning in Nate's arms to face him. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "And I love you," Nate replied, his hands coming up to frame her face with that same exquisite gentleness he'd always shown her. "My hands will only ever know tenderness when they touch you. That's a promise I'll keep forever." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, while their children played and the mountains stood eternal guard around them. Clara had never known hands that didn't hurt until she met Nate, but he had spent every day since showing her what love was supposed to feel like: gentle, respectful, safe. The years continued to roll by, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. Droughts came and went, winters were harsh, children got sick and recovered. But through it all, Nate and Clara's love remained constant, a foundation on which they built their lives. Daniel grew into a strong, capable young man who loved the mountains as much as his father. He learned tracking and hunting from Nate, but also inherited Clara's love of books and learning. By the time he was 16, he was helping his father guide hunting parties through the high country and reading philosophy in his spare time. Emma was fierce and independent, with her mother's determination and her father's physical strength. She could outride most of the boys in town and had no patience for anyone who suggested women were fragile. Clara saw herself in her daughter and made sure Emma received the education and opportunities she'd been denied. James was the gentle one, quiet and thoughtful, with an artistic soul. He loved to draw the mountains and animals, filling sketchbooks with detailed studies that showed real talent. Nate encouraged this, never trying to force his youngest into a more traditionally masculine mold. As the children grew older and more independent, Clara and Nate found themselves with more time together. They took long rides through the mountains, rediscovering the trails they'd explored in their early days. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, the conversation as easy and natural as breathing. One evening in the summer of 1890, when Daniel was 12 and planning to leave for college in Helena, Clara and Nate sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "We did good," Nate said quietly. "With the children, with this life. We did real good." "We did," Clara agreed, "though there were times I wasn't sure we'd make it. That first winter with Daniel, when he got so sick. Or when Emma fell from her horse and we thought she'd broken her back. Or all the times I worried that Martin would somehow find us before he died. But we made it through all of it," Nate pointed out, "because we had each other." Clara reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after so many years. "You kept your promise, you know. Your hands have only ever known tenderness with me." "It's an easy promise to keep when you love someone the way I love you," Nate said. "I could never hurt you, Clara. The thought of it makes me physically ill." "I know," Clara said. "I've always known. From that very first day when you stood between me and the bear, I knew you were different, that you were safe." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in impossible colors. Inside the cabin, they could hear the children talking and laughing, the sounds of a family at peace. "Do you think they understand how rare this is?" Clara asked. "What we have, I mean. Do they know that not all marriages are like ours?" "I hope they know that all marriages should be like ours," Nate said. "Based on respect and love and gentleness. I want them to expect that, to demand it in their own relationships." "We've shown them what's possible," Clara said. "The rest is up to them." The years continued their steady march. The children grew up and went their own ways, though none of them strayed far from the mountains they loved. Daniel became a territorial ranger, protecting the wilderness his father had taught him to love. Emma married a schoolteacher and opened a school of her own in Helena, fighting for education reform. James went to San Francisco to study art, but returned after a few years, saying the city made him feel claustrophobic after the wide open spaces of Montana. Nate and Clara grew older together, silver threading through Clara's dark hair, Nate's beard going white. Their bodies bore the marks of hard living and hard work, but they remained healthy and active, still riding through the mountains, still finding joy in each other's company. In 1895, Montana became a state, and Redemption Creek celebrated with the rest of the territory. Nate and Clara stood in the crowd listening to speeches about progress and civilization, and exchanged amused glances. "Progress," Nate muttered, "as if we weren't doing just fine before we were a state." "Change is inevitable," Clara said. "The question is whether we can hold on to what matters while everything else transforms around us." "And what matters?" Nate asked, though he knew the answer. "Family," Clara said immediately. "Love, the land, each other. Those things don't change just because some politicians in Washington decided to draw different lines on a map." That night, they made love in their cabin under the same mountains that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children. Nate touched Clara with the same reverence he always had, mapping her body like familiar territory that never lost its wonder. And Clara welcomed him with open arms and an open heart, grateful for every day, every year, every moment they'd been given. The new century arrived with celebration and speculation about what the future would hold. Nate and Clara, now in their 50s, watched from their mountain cabin and felt both excitement and trepidation. The world was changing rapidly. Automobiles were appearing in cities, electric lights were becoming common, airplanes were being invented. It was hard to imagine what the next 100 years would bring, but some things they knew would never change. Love would still matter, family would still be the foundation of life, and people would still need wild places, mountains and forests and rivers to remind them of what was real and true and lasting. In 1903, tragedy struck when Emma died in childbirth, leaving behind twin daughters and a devastated husband. Clara and Nate brought the babies, Sarah and Ruth, to the cabin and raised them as their own, starting the cycle of parenthood all over again in their 60s. It was exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also a gift, a chance to pour love into another generation. The twins thrived under their grandparents' care, growing up wild and free in the mountains. They learned to read and write from Clara, to track and hunt from Nate. They heard stories about their mother, about her strength and intelligence and fierce love, and they carried Emma's memory forward. Daniel married and had children of his own, and James eventually found a woman who loved both art and the wilderness. The family expanded, spreading through Montana but always staying connected to the cabin in the high country, to the place where it had all begun. Nate turned 70 in 1915, still strong and vital despite his age. He moved a bit slower than he once had, and his joints ached in cold weather, but he could still outwork men half his age when necessary. Clara was 60, her hair completely silver now, her face lined with laugh lines and sun exposure. But her eyes were still bright, still full of the intelligence and strength that had first attracted Nate. They celebrated Nate's birthday with a gathering of the entire family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren filling the cabin and spilling onto the porch and into the meadow. There was food and music and laughter, the sound of a family bound together by love and shared history. That night, after everyone had gone and it was just the two of them again, Nate and Clara sat by the fire and reflected on the life they'd built. 40 years, Clara said wonderingly. We've been together for 40 years. Best 40 years of my life, Nate said. Only good years of my life, really. Everything before you was just darkness and confusion. You would have found your way eventually, Clara said. You're too strong, too good to have stayed lost forever. Maybe, Nate conceded, but I wouldn't have found joy. I wouldn't have found love. You gave me that, Clara. You gave me everything. Clara leaned against him, fitting into his side the way she had for 4 decades. We gave it to each other. That's how love works, Nate. It's not one person saving the other. It's 2 people choosing each other every day, building something together that neither could have built alone. Wise words from a wise woman, Nate said, pressing a kiss to her hair. Have I told you lately that I love you? Only about a dozen times today, Clara said with a smile, but I never get tired of hearing it. Good, because I'm never going to stop saying it. They sat there as the fire burned down to embers, 2 people who had found each other in the wilderness and built a love that had lasted through decades and difficulties, through joy and sorrow, through every challenge life could throw at them. And as they finally made their way to bed, Nate took Clara's hand with the same gentle reverence he'd always shown, proving once again that his promise had never wavered. His hands had only ever known tenderness when they touched her, and they always would. The final years of their lives together were peaceful. They watched their grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow, passing on stories and wisdom, teaching the lessons they'd learned through hard experience. They continued to love the mountains, to find joy in simple things, sunrise over the peaks, the call of an eagle, the first flowers of spring. In 1920, Nate fell ill with pneumonia during a harsh winter. Despite Clara's careful nursing and the doctor's best efforts, he grew weaker. On a clear February morning, with Clara holding his hand and whispering words of love, Nathaniel Coltrain passed peacefully from the world. Clara grieved deeply, but she didn't break. Nate had made her too strong for that, had taught her too well how to survive. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by family, still teaching when she had the energy, still writing about her experiences for newspapers and journals. She died in the spring of 1925, in the cabin she and Nate had shared for so many years. Her children and grandchildren were with her, and her last words were reported to be, "Tell Nate I'm coming. Tell him I love him still." They buried her next to Nate in a spot they'd chosen years before, a small rise overlooking the meadow where their children had played. The headstones were simple, carved from local granite. Nathaniel Coltrain, 1845 to 1920. He knew only gentleness. Clara Coltrain, 1855 to 1925. She knew only love. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations. It became a gathering place, a reminder of where they'd all come from, of the love that had started it all. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew through the pines and the mountains turned purple in the twilight, some swore they could feel the presence of those who'd loved there first, of Nate and Clara watching over the wild country they'd called home. Their story became legend in Montana, passed down through the generations, the woman who'd fled violence and found safety, the mountain man who'd shown her that hands could be gentle, the love that had conquered fear and built something beautiful in the wilderness. It was a story that proved broken people could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, that love could triumph over pain. And in the end, wasn't that the story worth telling? Not one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, but of two damaged souls who'd found each other in the vastness of the American West and decided, against all odds and all obstacles, to choose love, to choose gentleness, to choose each other every single day until death parted them and beyond. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the cabin, bringing their own children to run in the meadows and splash in the streams. They tell the story of Nate and Clara, of how a mountain man with gentle hands and a woman who'd never known kindness built a love that lasted generations. They point to the graves on the hillside and speak of legacy, of what it means to choose tenderness over violence, love over fear. And the mountains stand eternal watch, as they always have, as they always will, keeping the secrets and stories of all who've loved within their shadow, bearing witness to the truth that Nate and Clara proved with their lives, that gentleness is strength, that love is courage, and that hands that know only tenderness can heal even the deepest wounds. The end came gently for both of them, as was fitting. But the love they'd built, the family they'd created, the example they'd set, those things lived on, growing and spreading like wildflowers across the mountain meadows, beautiful and wild and impossible to contain. They'd found their happily ever after, not in the absence of struggle, but in the choice to face every struggle together, with hands clasped and hearts united. And in the end, that was everything.